Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. An associate of mine, John Campion, who's a barrister, a courtroom barrister, and a constitutional lawyer, posted a really interesting historical context for this mutiny in Russia last weekend. And so I thought it would be interesting to check in with him because obviously he's a man interested in history and has a lot of knowledge of history. And he put the mutiny in Putin's position in sort of historical context compared to Stalin and some of the czars. So, John Campion, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Brian. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you again, sir. So, tell me, why did you want to post this tribute to the legacy of numerous different czars that have deposed themselves through kind of strange means?
So, in my days as a pre-medical student, I had a continuous fight with one of my friends, which was more important, history or science. And when I graduated or was about to graduate in law, I went to him and I said, all right, I want a history reading list. And what was important for me is that I didn't really have a clear view of what lay behind 1918. We knew bits and pieces of it through Henry VIII, but we didn't really have a clear vision as to how and what the world had done prior to that time, because we were so caught up in the two world wars when I was growing up, in the same vintage as you are. So I started reading history, and it's been extremely helpful for me in my law practice, because, of course, it's an historical enterprise, and both immediate and long term. And so I just kept going and going, and I will say that the history of Russia, along with others, but the history of Russia is unbelievably complex and fascinating beyond all measure.
And so in this post that you put up, you were comparing the mutiny against Putin and saying we had seen this story before.
We had seen this story before. So let me give you just if I might, a distant history. Modern states were being formed in and around the 1500s and the early 1500s. France, under Henry VII in England, and in a host of places throughout Europe. And the modern state required power, it required money, mainly money. They didn't have it, they didn't know how to tax, they only had agricultural bases to do it. And the only trading was done was largely through Venice, going into Europe and Amsterdam. So they started creating states in different ways, and Ivan the Terrible in the 1530s began to create Russia. And he started with an advantage. All of the people considered themselves personally to be slaves of their prince, namely Ivan the Terrible. He was the first to establish the Russian secret security agency. He took over whole provinces for his private will. He unleashed a reign of unrestrained terror. He razed Novgorod to the ground and slaughtered all of its population to affirm Moscow's supremacy. He appointed the first patriarch of Moscow, much the same as Henry VIII got rid of the Catholic Church, so that he could control the church and have a separate Russian Orthodox Church. So he created all the elements of a modern state. And then he went in 1562, captured the Khanate of Kazan, which was with its Christian church there, although it was a Muslim state. And what he did there was he declared that he had unrestrained imperial ambitions. And from that day to this, we have seen Russian unrestrained imperial traditions. So what happened after Ivan the Terrible passed away? Well, his son was there for a while, didn't last long. And then they had five ill-starred czars over 15 years in what they call the time of troubles. Their troubles were peasant revolts, the invasion by the Swedes, Poles, and Tartars. And there's one thing you must remember. Ukraine was Polish territory, not Russian territory. Moscow was created out of Kiev, but Poland controlled Ukraine. It lost it, but it has a modern echo. So in these various ones, the first Tsar was Godunov, and he was ultimately deposed and killed for himself, killing the heir to the Tsardom. Then came along false Dmitri, number one. He was an imposter, he declared himself to be the Tsar, and his fate was to be fired from a cannon across Red Square.
Fired from a
It
cannon.
ended, fired from a cannon.
Who
False
fired
Dimitri
him?
number, sorry?
Who fired him?
Oh, so the local population fired him because False Dimitri number 1 had married a Polish princess called Marina. And she comes into the second story because False Dimitri number 2 persuaded Marina that he was her resurrected husband. So False Dimitri number 2 didn't last long. In the end, around 1610, the Poles and the Swedes captured Russia and invaded and held Moscow. Ultimately, the citizens burned their own town to get rid of the Poles and the Swedes, mainly the Poles, and they were routed. And the characters who came along were Minin the Butcher, Pisarsky the Prince, and Michael Romanov, who ultimately became the Tsar from 1613 to 1645. And that family held power for 304 years.
The
But I
Romanovs.
stress again, they acquired Ukraine from Poland in that period. So it's
Acquired
not
by way of purchase or
War.
invasion?
war, defeating the Poles. So in 1904, the Tsar decided, this was Nicholas II, decided he needed some activity outside the country to keep the peasant population from exploding. So he ordered his troops to prepare and conduct a war against Japan, Japan being seen as a completely weak modern military country. He lost the war. And when he lost the war, that was really the beginning of the end of the Tsar. It was only 13 years later that he abdicated at the request of Parliament because the street demonstrations were so high, normal life had completely halted. In this chaos of people in the streets, armed forces, and disgruntled armed forces because of the collapse of the front in the First War, the communists, with very few people, seized power. And oddly enough, it was led by Lenin, who the Germans had put into a sealed car and whisked him from Switzerland into Russia in order to basically carry on this chaos, hoping he would just create trouble and the Germans could take advantage of it, little knowing that Lenin was so organized himself and so successful that he, of course, took control of the country as best they could. But it wasn't full control. The White Russians left, about 900,000 of them, and they took a lot of their money and went to Paris, and you still have those families.
900,000?
Yes.
900,000 White Russians moved to Paris.
Well, and elsewhere. But certainly Paris. Even today, in my time, I went and had dinner on Ile Saint-Louis, and it's along with the Rothschilds, it's made up of a whole host of very wealthy White Russians of that time. So important thing, these items, while they sound distant, are very much in our world today. We just don't completely see them. So in 1921,
let's go back if we could.
Mm-hmm.
So
Sure.
Russia obviously had a navy at that time in 1904 when they attacked Japan.
Yeah. Yes.
And did they attack the Japan, like Japan proper, or was just a naval?
No, it was a war that took place in I guess it's the China Sea, not China Sea, the Japan Sea. I've forgotten exactly what it's called, but it's at Vladivostok, which is where the battle took place.
That's a long way from Moscow.
Witness the first, as I started out, where they made their declaration in 1562 of unrestrained imperial ambitions, and they stretched. Don't forget, it's the largest country in the world, Canada being the second largest, and it's not by accident. It was a plan, much the same as the British created an empire that spanned oceans. This was an empire that spanned land. And now there's not a lot of people there.
At the time, you were saying that the military and the people protest. Was it top military generals that changed the mind that the Tsar wasn't the person that they should be backing?
No, it was the garrisons. The garrisons joined together to street demonstrations because they were so distressed at the loss of the front, and the Romanovs, of course, had to take the heat because they were running the war. They're their cousins. So
okay, sorry,
yeah, that's where the revolution came. But it wasn't so easy for
you jumped to Lenin.
Sure. So there's a naval garrison at Kronstadt, and it revolted, mutinied, and it was backed in the background in the prospect of civil war by heavy industrial strikes and peasant revolts. Lenin and Trotsky, and I mentioned Trotsky, not Stalin, introduced brutal military measures to suppress the rebellions. Quietly, Stalin ascended. He was a Georgian, not a mainline Russian, ascended in the party. He, oddly enough, submitted his resignation on several occasions while eyeing his challengers, namely Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev. Ultimately, all three of those were murdered by Stalin. In 1924, Lenin, having been shot, died of his wounds and ill health, and he footnoted in his will that Stalin should not succeed him as head of the party because while Stalin was helpful within the party, he was far too rough to become the new head of state.
Lenin actually had this in his will.
Wrote it in a footnote to his will. By 1950, 30 years later, through all the chaos and all the incredible death and starvation in Ukraine, and of course the continuing of the security agency, which it's been started by Ivan the Terrible, still in full force, Stalin managed to eliminate all of his competitors, even if they weren't. He became somewhat paranoid, it seems. His starvation of Ukraine when he took all the grain and took them away. But then he suffered in 1953 a medical issue at his Dhaka. In a soft coup, Stalin's associates simply didn't call for medical assistance, and Stalin died. So then we get Khrushchev. And from 53 to 64, Khrushchev was there, and he was considered rough-hewn. And ultimately, he was couped by vote of the Politburo, citing his arrogance, his economic mismanagement, and his failed Cuban Missile Crisis problem. He actually took a bow. It was almost as if it was a regular transfer of power. Ultimately, they had a few older gentlemen come and go and died young, but they were very elderly members of the party until Gorbachev in 1991, or slightly earlier, had taken power. And he faced co-conspirators, the KGB chief, Khrushchev, and a series of others, and they all lost their nerve. They started the rebellion and then lost their nerve. And they ultimately ended up with depression, mindlessness, drunkenness, and confined themselves to hospitals, ultimately all arrested. But Gorbachev was politically wounded, and he never recovered full power. The foundations of the USSR fell apart, and the USSR dissolved in 1991.
So when was Glasnost and Perestroika?
They were 89 to 91. And the wall was taken down in 89.
And so Gorbachev had instituted those, but was that before or after his the challenge to his power?
Before.
So he was a reformer, and it sounds like he was the one that wasn't in the likes of Ivan the Terrible.
Yes, and I will say, in fairness to the Romanovs, they were trying to get their state to be a modern state, but they had laws. They'd passed laws in the 1649 where they perpetuated and systematized serfdom, where people didn't have any rights and they didn't have a political culture. And it really, I mean, it's obviously changed, but they were trying to make some change. They were certainly trying to modernize the state with railroads and a number of other features. But it's hard in a position of change that you don't get eaten up by the change. Some people like it, some people hate it, some people feel like their power has been taken away. All of them are dangerous. And so Gorbachev had, with his reform, was facing a lot of institutional weight, and the state itself was running out of money, couldn't control. I mean, when you take over an empire in Central Europe, you got to be able to finance it. Well, they couldn't.
Right.
And so, you know, like all empires, it ultimately falls by its own weight or finds a way to revitalize itself. The Americans had one of the shortest empires in all of history because they ended up in wars they should never have been in: Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and have tried to control too much of the world. There's a reason for it. Maybe they'll recover. They're still the best economy in the world, but they certainly aren't the single power of the world that they were when Russia fell apart. So
we're going to have to take a break, John, for a message, and we're going to be back with John Campion talking about sort of the historical context that the mutiny in Russia last weekend took place within. Stay with us, everyone. This is an interesting historical story. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having an interesting conversation tonight with John Campion. He's a courtroom barrister. He is a constitutional lawyer. He's a very smart historical gentleman, and he is a student of history that has tried to put the mutiny in Russia last weekend in sort of historical context. And I guess you're going to draw some lessons from this, but we'll come to that in a couple of minutes. So let me ask you a few questions, if I could. When you said that the Poles actually controlled Ukraine back in the 1600s, yes. When and how did Russia take control of Ukraine?
So that story began when the Poles and the Swedes, during the 1598 period to say 1615, they invaded Russia, and they had a big battle at Novgorod, and then they had an open road to Moscow. The Poles took it; the Swedes didn't, although they'd been part of the war. And you forget the fact that the Poles had a vast empire. And you also should remember, there's a book written about, 5 years ago, about what would be the most powerful nation on earth in 100 years' time. And the author chose Poland. So Poland isn't a minor European state. And I'm not sure all the reasons now, and I'm not sure that he would conclude that today, but it's a very powerful populous state. And needless to say, the Poles and the Russians have not been long friends. And so Ukraine belonged to Poland. And there's one thing important to remember. If you were Genghis Khan and you stood on the Mongolian plains and looked west, you would be able to mount your horses, which they did, and ride straight across, go sweeping around the Urals, sweeping around the Alps, and go straight down to the Mediterranean in France as a complete run. All you had to do was cross rivers. So that you've got a vast European plain that Ukraine is part of.
Right.
And so it's easily, as the Nazis did, it's easy to invade because it's flat. And so you just roll your tanks in, or you roll your horses across. And if you're faster and more brutal than everybody else, you can take it fairly quickly because there's no natural protections like mountains protecting Switzerland or protecting northern Italy or various and sundry other ranges that protect, for instance, the Pyrenees protecting Spain. All of those things, they don't impact that whole area that we're dealing with. So it has been the subject of countless changes from Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, all the way through to the Nazis. And the Poles and the Russians have been arguing over it since they lost it in the 1610 to 12 range, when the Russian Moscow people threw out the Poles and kept pushing and ultimately took control of the Ukraine and claimed it to be their own.
But during the period of the USSR, Ukraine was a country. It had a president, albeit part of the USSR. No?
It was a bit like East Germany, but it was like Belarus is today. There's a separate person, but they know where the power lies. And if Moscow says do something, you do it. No,
but Belarus is a separate country. It's maybe controlled by Putin, but it's not part of the United States, the United Soviet Republic.
It isn't now. You're absolutely right. But my proposition is this. The reason this war has triggered is that Russia lost control of the presidency of Ukraine. It hasn't lost control of the presidency of Belarus. And once that happened, Putin had to make a decision. Was he going to just leave that as the status quo? Because he knew that they would be drawn into the European orbit and into the EU, where it's a much better economy And they are the breadbasket largely of the world, certainly of Africa, and certainly of Europe, which is why the Germans invaded, because they ran out of food in the first war. So they said, right, if we're going to have food, we better control the Ukraine. And they also wanted the Ukrainian oil.
What about Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, etc.?
Well, they were Muslim nations that Russia took over by conquest or just moving in, and they control them about the same way. Huge control, and if they step out of line like they did in Georgia, the Russians invaded again in modern times. Similarly, so I suppose Afghanistan, which was hardly a success, that brought down the Russian Empire. They had their war in Afghanistan. And then Chechens, they were trouble. They wanted their own independence. They kept trying, and they were invaded, and ultimately some peace was made. And it's a peace of cooperation. Basically, Putin says, look, you don't do this, and I won't do that. And they agree. And if they change their minds...
Effectively, Putin was trying to recreate the USSR.
He was distressed beyond all measure that Gorbachev lost the USSR. That the whole thing fell apart. He thought that was the biggest tragedy in the history of mankind. And he still does. And so he wants it back. And Ukraine, they think of them, of course, as their cousins. It's like the Americans and the Canadians. We're on both sides of the border. People are related on all sides. And they speak not the same language, but close enough to. And they're all intermarried. So they're shooting at their cousins. It's not quite an American Civil War situation, but it's close. And lots of families have people in Kyiv and the other part of the family living in Moscow.
Now, part of your thesis is that losing a war is a bad thing for leaders. And you use the example of the war in Japan, the Russian-Japanese war. What about Afghanistan? Russia, as you mentioned, obviously had a terrible time in Afghanistan. Who was leader of Russia at the time, or the USSR at the time?
Good question. Before Gorbachev, after Khrushchev, and it was one of the three whose names escape me for the moment, but it was a war. I mean, look, they've been fighting over Afghanistan, the British Empire and the Russians, since they had the Crimean War in 1854. It's not as if this territory hasn't been run over a lot. Yeah. Afghanistan, this is controlling that whole eastern part of the empire of the British, and they wanted to control it. It's not controllable. And the Americans armed the Afghanis to blow out the Russians, and the Russians spent all their coin and men, and of course, received a ton of unpopularity, but mainly spent their coin. They didn't have the money to run such an extraordinary war. Can't have both guns and butter. So let me quickly go to this Putin and what happened with Prigozhin. So in my view, Putin started out, Yeltsin took power after Gorbachev failed, and then he appointed Putin his heir apparent. And Putin started with a sense, as George Bush Jr. said, with freedoms and world cooperation and economic well-being and he had oil to spend. He managed to get the Europeans to buy his oil, therefore he held them hostage. And he was generally a bit of trouble, but in the Middle East, but that's his area of power. And a lot of people from India and from Turkey, they're all on the same sea, so they got to be nice to the Russians and vice versa. They don't need another war. So he was going along trying to run a world in a complex way. And the trouble is that over time, whether it's a result of the Ukraine or whether it's a result of more things, he descended into terror. He eliminated all opposition. He used the police state, which Ivan the Terrible had created, and continued it. He had wars with his neighbors, the Chechens and the Georgians. He began the Donetsk takeover in the Ukraine. 214, he goes and annexes Crimea, and Americans have a weak international president and do very little. And when he started his war in Ukraine in 2022, he frightened away all of his best and brightest. They left the country. They weren't going to go and fight their cousins in the Ukraine and get shot at and killed. No way. They're all gone.
I saw a report that showed that the average age in Russia is one of the highest in the world, mainly because of all the people that were of fighting age that left the country.
Sure. But they were the smart ones because they had brains and language skills to go and run the computers of the world and do other things like that. So he's losing a huge talent base. But then we come to Prigozhin. So he's the monster's monster. He's the one who sort of gets created as a private army. Now, private armies, I suppose, are a great idea. Reagan had private supply of guns and got himself into a whole trainload of trouble, as you may remember, in South America. But having a private army being created and calling it Wagner and letting them run around and do the dirty work in Africa, where they were taking over countries with big gold mines and taking all the gold, and where they were going to Syria to pretend that they had a power base in Syria. And remember, that's Russia's neighborhood. That's not America's neighborhood. But they're near the oil. So there's all kinds of good reasons that the Russians are running around in that territory. But how much better if you've got some private army to do it for you and say it's not me. So he did. And the man was, he'd grown up with Putin. He had become a caterer, which is why they call him Putin's chef. And he kept getting, when there's some dirty thing that had to happen, Putin kept asking him to take it on, and he took it on. And he was being given billions to do all these things.
Getting billions from who? Who was hiring him?
The state, Putin.
Putin was hiring him.
Supplying, yeah.
The guy spent 8 years in jail as a petty criminal.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And he started out after jail as a hot dog vendor.
Well, but he ended up being a caterer, indeed a caterer to Putin. But what that difference is, I really don't know. It's more than a hot dog, but maybe a hot dog is a good name for him in one way, because he's plainly got a tender ego, and he was under threat. So he's been complaining about the generals in Russia and how badly they've executed the war in Ukraine.
Probably justifiably.
Yes, and he has shown that he can do it, but he and his people and all his armed forces are drawn from the worst of the worst in Russian jails.
No, not all. I heard like a third to a half, but
right.
that a lot of it is former special forces from the Russian army.
But I'll take your proposition. The part that's most concerning is that, number one, these guys are toughened criminals and murderers. They're not nice, easy people. Not all of them. I take your point, but they are very tough, and they're heavy-duty warriors in battle all over the world. So even if they weren't good warriors then, they are now, but they're tough guys. And now Prigozhin decides they were going to end Prigozhin's independence, take him into the regular army. And he said, over my dead body, he went and took the main supply post in southern Russia and got on the road and went straight to Moscow, and nobody stopped him. A couple of helicopters came by and he blew them out of the air. And the question really is, in these circumstances, why was he not opposed? Did he have a deal that fell apart? And he's on the road to Moscow, and he gets a call from his buddy from Belarus, and he says, I can negotiate a deal for you to get you out of this mess. Why he did it, nobody knows. But I have my own theory of this one. Not theory, but I have my own concern. Is this all a ruse? Are they just transferring the Wagner people to Belarus so they can attack the Ukraine from the north? Remember, it's only about 30 or 40 miles from Kiev to the Belarus border. Or are the head of Poland today complained that he was very worried with the Wagnerians in Belarus that they would attack Central Europe. So I don't think it's a ruse because of this reason. Putin's power has been negatively affected mainly by the war in Ukraine and its failure, but certainly by the mutiny. And once you have a problem, and this is where the lesson is learned, once you have a problem inside your group and it becomes public, both parties suffer. Certainly the Prigozhin is, who knows if he has any power left or not. I guess he had to leave behind all of his equipment, but I don't know. And I don't know where his soldiers are and how they're going to be supplied. Has Putin got some clever trick up his sleeve? I don't think so, because this was too negative an impact. And my proposition is that coups, which aren't like revolutions, coups are taking people out of the top. It doesn't mean there's going to be a change in any policy. They just get taken out for failure. much the same as Nicholas II or Gorbachev or Stalin in the end, although he was sort of went out by natural causes in the main. So I look at all this and I say, all right, let's assume that you're head of an organization and you've got 5 people who are all vying for your job. They're your friends and they take your orders and you have control, but you make a mistake and you'll be gone tomorrow and one of them will replace you. So as Stalin was eyeing his Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, same happens in other organizations. There's another important lesson here that I've noticed. If you are running an organization, let's say you're in charge of 20 people, so it's an easy number to manage, and there's a complaint about poor treatment, unfair treatment, or whatever it might be, the complainer and the person against who the complaint is made both suffer in the power structure. Nobody escapes it. And that's why the lesson is you got to know, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, and always have an eye to solve problems as they arise long before they become critical. If you leave them and they become critical, both the complainant and the person receiving the complaint will suffer in the power structure. And in the long run, they won't become head of the bank, the next head of the bank.
Yeah, I understand and I agree with you, but I guess I think that whether it be in Russia or in any kind of organization, since you're talking about any organization, you got to have a democratic kind of boss, not an authoritarian. Because I think the biggest mistake that authoritarian bosses and or dictators make is that they get rid of all of their opponents. And if they get rid of all their opponents, then all that's left is yes men and incompetent men. And I think that's the problem that Putin's in right now. Is he's got and the head of Wagner, I think, pointed that out, that his generals that are running the army are incompetent, and he's not being told the truth of what's going on in Ukraine. And he wasn't told the truth before the war started. So that's the problem. And if you have great people around you and you're there because they think you're the right leader, then you've got a team that can work together. But as soon as you start deposing all of those good people because you're worried they're going to take over, you end up having this authoritarian dictator type leadership model that is not sustainable in the long term because they become yes men and incompetent. No?
It may or may not be sustainable, but it's sustainable by very, very difficult means. And you have to continuously get more and more accustomed to terror and to security agencies and all those kinds of things and put a pall over an entire country. But it's easier to do today with the communication systems that we have, the spying systems that we have, than it was some time ago. So dictators have maybe a longer shelf life because of that, but leave that aside, I agree with your propositions. And I think they're worthy for everybody who's exercising large or small influence over others, that they keep in mind your democratic principle of fairness and understanding and anticipating. And I will say all those things are very hard work, as you know. They're very hard work to keep up with it.
We're going to take a break. We're chatting with John Campion. He is a barrister, a courtroom barrister, a constitutional lawyer, a student of history, and he's putting this putsch, this mutiny, this coup in Russia that took place a couple of weekends ago into historical context and comparing it to Stalin, to Gorbachev, to the Tsars, to Ivan the Terrible, etc. It's fascinating. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. John Campion, a courtroom barrister, a constitutional lawyer, a student of history, is chatting with me tonight, putting this mutiny in Russia into historical context. And it's really quite interesting to see the similarities between the Tsars who lost the war between Russia and Japan and then lost a public uprising, and the communists took over a very small group that Stalin lost because people didn't bring in healthcare professionals when he had some illnesses, and he died of natural causes that just weren't treated. Khrushchev, who was defeated really with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Gorbachev, who had his own challenges. The war in Afghanistan, and you took it all the way back to Ivan the Terrible. It's a fascinating review of history. A couple of things that I'd like to chat about. In your last comment, you were worried that the Wagner's group going to, and Prigozhin going to Belarus is a ruse, and that maybe there'll be an attack. So, I heard that there's 500 tents, and these tents are so big at a military base in South Belarus that you could have 5,000 to 10,000 troops in them. So they must be pretty massive military tents. And so if you've got that kind of people, of a military power, they must have come by road from Russia. They couldn't, Prigozhin flew in supposedly, but you couldn't have flown in that many people. With that kind of an army, and presuming they brought some, if not all, of their military stuff with them, they've got to do something, don't they? They can't just sit there. They can't train forever. They're gonna be deployed somewhere.
Well, I guess I'm making a couple of observations. Number one, it may just be a staging base to go back to Africa and to do whatever they will there, because the one thing that it seems a baseline, and that is the troops expect to be paid handsomely for what they're doing, and not wages. They expect to be taking, like conquerors from all history, they expect to be taking gold from gold mines in Africa or whatever else they're up to. So number one, they're there for a reason that's selfish. They're not there for some glorified state reason. They're not even at home anymore. And they were operating largely out of the home until they got into the war in Ukraine. So my first proposition is no one can really guess what they're going to do. I just heard today the head of Poland's foreign affairs group said that he believed that this could be very disruptive in Central Europe.
I think it's got to be. It's got to be. And I think the other thing that we talked about was that my understanding is that the whole Wagner organization up until Ukraine was primarily former Russian special forces. And so what Prigozhin did is he hired and paid, as you pointed out, very handsomely, the best of the best within the Russian military that were trained extremely well and didn't want to stay in the Russian military sort of sitting around waiting for something to happen. They wanted to go and do stuff in Syria. They wanted to go and do stuff in Africa. And it wasn't until the Ukrainian invasion that he persuaded Putin to allow him to go to the Russian prisons and recruit all these prisoners. And you may be right. You're probably right that they're not nice people, but they were used as, I understand, cannon fodder. They were the people at the front lines that were sent forward by the more well-trained Russian special forces people that were working for Wagner. But if these people that were incredibly well-trained and had left the Russian military and had worked for Prigozhin and Wagner in Syria, in Africa, and had become wealthy, and then they were confronted with this demand that by July 1st, they had to join the regular Russian army and take orders from generals they didn't respect. It's kind of understandable that they would.
It is understandable, and creating a private militia is always going to be dangerous, always, because they can say, well, like Napoleon, who became head of the French army, he then in November 9th, 1799, overthrew Directory and became dictator. And he had this incredible success. He started as a Corsican. He wasn't a Frenchman. He became a cannoneer. He was superb at weapons. And he was obviously a natural born leader with a huge range. And he wasn't putting up with the Director anymore, and he threw it out. That was the first modern coup. And so create somebody like that, Prigozhin, Napoleon, they're not quite the same, with military power. And here's one of the definitions. So this is really talking about a coup d'etat as opposed to something else, which is a coup meaning a success. And it's a sudden or violent overflow of an existing government by a small group. A key for a coup is control of all or part of the armed forces, the police, or other military elements. While there's an abrupt change at the top, you don't necessarily expect any change in policy. It's just a time to go, and they don't have any other easy means, like a democratic process and people voting, to get rid of them. So that's the coup. The first modern coup in our modern era is Napoleon. The second one is in 1851, Louis Napoleon, except for in South America, There was a worldwide economic collapse in 1825, just as the South Americans were throwing off the Spanish and creating independent countries, all at the instance of, and using the example of, the Americans and the French. When the economies collapsed, a series of military interventions in countries through coups led to a constant array of coups that have largely destroyed some elements of democracy in some states in South America. But it's interesting because it fell apart on, they were building railroads, they were chasing gold, all the modern sort of craziness of a modern economy developing in 1825, it collapsed around the world, and it really impacted South America. Everything seemed to come to a halt, and that's why they have had less good luck in their democracies than other places in the world. Post-1960s Africa, same thing. You have the Europeans in Africa were brutal. Nobody can escape the brutality that the Europeans put. So leave aside Africa for a second. I was just in Vietnam a couple of weeks ago. And the reason the French in 1860s wanted Vietnam was a number of reasons. Their raw materials, etc., was rubber. And the company that stood most to gain was Michelin, where they grew all their rubber trees in Vietnam. And they created a corporate environment which was basically closer to slavery than it was to anything else. But that's why they held on as long as they could to 1953, when Ho Chi Minh slaughtered the entire French army that was protecting, in effect, Michelin. Although there's some other good parts, they aren't all bad with this one, but they were. But going now then to Africa, well, how many countries have suffered coups in Africa? Because they had the Congo with extraordinary natural resources, Nigeria with some of the largest supplies of oil in the world. They've created these places where if you have the military power, you can take it and you can take the money for yourself. And that seems to have a common element, that this isn't just a matter of public control and trying to create order out of chaos, it's also private wealth. And Putin and his friends appear, from everything we can see, to be using their power in Russia. They took over all the state elements and handed out the oil power to some, the trading power to another, and all throughout the entire economy. All of that led to a small group of people who are fabulously wealthy, showing their wealth off around the world. And guess what? You shouldn't do that. You know, the reason why Imelda Marcos got in so much trouble is that she had more shoes than people have dollar bills in her cupboard, and she showed it off. So all of a sudden, she looked frivolous, and her husband became vulnerable. And there's other stories too, but since I know them, I'm not going to deal with them. So that's right. So coups happen for different reasons. In the Middle East, after 1945, the British and the French in the main, and with the Americans, they had the oil wealth. They just split up these countries in a way that really after First World War and Second World War, it made no sense the way they split them up. They were tribal. And as a result, we have this continuing fight between religious Muslim groups, different kinds of tribes, and so forth. And you have dictators who've taken over power, control all the wealth, and run their societies. So the coup is a long-standing institution and has led to, I mean, I suppose you could even say the Communist Party of China is a form of a coup. And they move their people from A to B to C to D. I mean, to get to be the head of China, he had to take out a lot of people to get to where he is. So I think it was,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I think it was Paul Collier, former World Bank economist, who wrote the book, The Bottom Billion, who suggested that the resource curse led to coups often and strife. And the reason why was because you didn't have to have a lot of people share the wealth and get involved, unlike an industrial revolution where you needed a whole bunch of people to be involved. A few people could take control, and so therefore you have that fight for control of the natural resource on a regular basis, and therefore it was sort of natural that you would have different groups fighting over those ownership of those natural resources on an ongoing basis. It didn't have to include a whole bunch of people. One of the other natural resource curse natural situations. And
I'm going to come back to the non-political world for a second. Capitalism, you will note that most people who run capitalist countries want control. And there's a reason for it. And it allows them to have the control and allows them to have an extended period of time for not the kind of wealth that you can take, but certainly the kind of wealth you get paid for, and big pensions. And so the whole running of companies and how they govern themselves and or partnership type organizations that are huge, whatever they might be. In fact, there's just been a huge fight in one of the big accounting firms, E&Y. They wanted to take one of their units and make it independent, the consulting unit. They agreed to move on it. And then the Americans in E&Y said no. And they had a huge fight and they won. They're not separating E&Y into different units. So this whole notion of who's running what and how long you can do it over what popularity or lack of popularity is extremely interesting because it plays itself in other places.
I agree, but I come back to it's not the right structure long-term, because to have complete control with either one person or one group, by definition, you've got to get rid of the people that are going to tell the emperor that he has no clothes. You're going to have to end up with yes men. And by definition, in the end, you won't have a successful organization. And the key to a successful, I believe the key to a successful organization is having creative destruction, having creative discussions, having disputes and discussions and negotiations, such that in the end, diversity develops the best solution and strategies. And if you have a bunch of yes men, you'll never get that.
So in aid of your propositions, I've just finished 2 MBAs. One from Rotman and one from Bocconi in Italy, which they did together, and we did it around the world in 10 cities, largely over COVID. Took a lot longer, and we were there first class. And we spent a lot of time on how to develop within an organization leadership skills. And the kinds of things you're talking about are the subject a lot of business school discussion. And it was terrific for me as a lawyer, because lawyers don't tend to talk about their own organization structure. They're worrying about clients and client issues and things like that, and maybe politics and maybe 1,000 other things, but they don't necessarily work on their organizational and leadership skills within their own organization. But I will say the business schools do. And I know that the law schools are beginning to try and catch up on this, but it's your observations are part and parcel. And there is a course called the Creative Destruction Lab, which is at U of T, the Rotman School of Business, which is the leading AI laboratory in the world. Their books are published by Harvard. Harvard would grab them in a moment, and they have been extremely successful in helping AI companies go from, relatively speaking, junior companies to worldwide successes. And they produce people who are the internet experts around the world. So your Creative Destruction Lab is a terrific idea.
We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. Interesting conversation about putting the mutiny, the coup d'etat, the whatever you want to call it, last week in Russia in historical context with John Campion, a barrister, a courtroom barrister, and a constitutional lawyer. John, what's your final conclusion from this interesting historical context discussion?
Well, the human dimension, self-knowledge and leadership skills run through all of these issues. You can have all kinds of skills and certainly all kinds of different and crazy opportunities. Any number of people might well have taken over Russia in 1917. But in the end, a strong sense of self-knowledge, which I think Lenin had, a very powerful plan, and leadership skills are the elements that will lead to success. And if you're ever doing anything, developing a realistic sense of your own human failings and capacities is very important. And I suppose I'll take one last thing. Our former Governor General David Johnson was a professor of mine and remained a very nice acquaintance. And he just is one of the men who projects, in spite of his recent issues, he projects a sense of warmth and fairness and understanding to everybody around him and gives everybody dignity. If people approach the world that way, then you will have a much better world, both for yourself and for everybody around you. Thank you.
John, I'm going to give you one example. I used to work for Jim Pattison, sole entrepreneur that runs a $9 billion enterprise, owned 100% by himself. And when we had major management meetings, he would always speak last. He would go around the room. He had 6 people that reported to him on a fairly regular basis, managing directors, and he'd go around the room and ask every single one of them their opinion. And then he would speak last. I've worked for a lot of other bosses who speak first. And the difference was Jimmy wanted to hear what everyone else had to say before he came to his conclusion. A lot of other people just want to conclude themselves because they think they're the smartest guy in the room. And they may be the smartest guy in the room, but Jimmy wanted the benefit of a whole bunch of other smart people. That's what I think the big difference is that people that just want yes men will never be as successful as people that can actually have around them a whole bunch of other people that are smart too. Anyway, that's the show for tonight. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. Good night, everybody.